Welcome, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We're on the second book of Kings, chapter 3. So we begin with a story of how Yoram, who is the son of Achav, he is now the king. And he had call it a deal with the nation of Aram, which is east of Israel. But after his father died, Achav was, for all of his evil, he was a very strong king. As soon as he died, the king of Aram rebelled against his son, and he's coming to fight against the northern kingdom. So this is the second time that we see the northern kingdom turns to the southern kingdom, even though their relations are not good. And it's the same king of the southern kingdom that we had before, Jehoshaphat, who is considered a righteous king. And Yoram says to him, "Will you come and fight with me?" And interestingly enough, Jehoshaphat answers in the same way he did the first time he was requested. And he said, I am as you are. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. In other words, yes, I will go up with you and we will fight together against Aram. And here, the country of Edom, who Israel had very shaky relationships for generations. Of course, Edom comes from Esav. But these three kings get together because they feel that there's a mutual danger in Aram becoming stronger. And they are going to go to war. So they begin by going out with their armies, but they could not find any water. You can't have thousands of troops and no water. So they don't know what to do. And Jehoshaphat says, isn't there a prophet that we can turn to? And the king of the northern kingdom, Yoram, said, yes, there's Elisha. And Elisha, the phrase that they use is Asher Yatzak Mayim al Yedei Eliyahu. He used to pour water over the hands of Eliyahu, meaning he was very, very close to, one second. He was very close to Eliyahu. And we can trust that his prophecy will be good. So these three kings, Yoram of the northern kingdom, the king of Edom, and the king of the southern kingdom, Jehoshaphat, go to Elisha. And they ask, should we go to war? So Elisha's first response is, remember, Yoram is not a good king. He's described as being an evil king, not as evil as his father Achav, but still evil enough. And Elisha is somewhat taken back that they're coming to him and asking for him to prophesy whether they should go to war or not. So Elisha says, more or less, go ask your own prophets. Don't come to me. And then he not notices, but he takes note that Jehoshaphat is one of the kings. And Jehoshaphat is a righteous king. And here we see how righteous he is because the northern kingdom from the time it was set up, has not had one righteous king. They've all been evil kings. They've all worshipped idols and worse. And yet Jehoshaphat says, your people are my people. In other words, in a certain way, that shows his righteousness, that despite all of their evil, we're brothers, we're all Jews. So that does show his righteousness. So Elisha says to them, if it wasn't for the fact that Jehoshaphat was here, I would not even talk to you. And so Elisha is now in what we would call a bad mood. He's been put in a bad mood. So what's coming up here is short, but it's a very, very significant part of the story here. So he said, call, I'm going to read it in Hebrew. It says, V'ata kuli minagen. And now bring for me a musician. V'hoya kinagen haminagen v'tehi alav yad Hashem. And when the musician began to play, the Spirit of God was on Elisha. So this is one of the main sources in the Tanakh of the connection of music and prophecy. The other major connection is when Shaul is first made king. And he just doesn't believe it. He can't believe that he's been chosen as king. He was very, very humble. And he resisted the idea that God had chosen him to be king. So Shmuel gave him a series of events that would happen to him. And he would know that when I say I'm speaking in God's name and God has chosen you as king, you'll believe me. Because I'm telling you, these things are going to happen to you. And so everything he said would happen. And the last one was that when you're going on your way, you will meet up with a band of minstrels, and they will be playing music. And when they play music, they will begin to prophesy. And you will begin to prophesy with them, and you will be turned into a different person. And that's exactly what happened. And here, so in both of these stories, these are the two main stories of the connection of music to prophecy. So we see that when Eliyahu set up schools of prophecy, and he was teaching ways to become a proper vessel for prophecy, one of those ways was through music. And that the music would put someone into a meditative, mystical state of mind. And in that state of mind, it would be possible to be able to receive prophetic experience. So when it says that they with Shaul, they were playing music and they began to prophesy in a certain way, what it means that they began to have a higher level of consciousness where they could receive messages from God. But prophetic experience is not necessarily receiving messages from God. Prophetic experience is what maybe today we would call a spiritual, transcendental experience. It doesn't mean that you're a prophet, but it's a kind of experience where you transcend your usual mode of thinking, of mental activity, to a higher level where you could be a recipient of prophecy. So here, Elisha, because he's kind of like in a bad mood of these kings, two of them which are he considered evil kings, and only one righteous. But now he is agreed to prophesy, but he's not in a good mood. So he says, bring me the musician. And when the musician began to play, so literally the hand of God was on Elisha, and he did begin to prophesy. And so what he told them is that you just went 7 days and could not find any water, meaning that there's no way that you could be prepared to fight a war. So here, this is one of the 16 miracles performed by Elisha. We discussed this last week, that when he asked for 2 portions of Eliyahu's ruach before he ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot, he asked for a double portion. And Eliyahu said, if you see me ascending to heaven in a fiery chariot, you will be blessed with double my spirit. And that is what happened. That according to tradition, Eliyahu, and it's in the text, performed 8 miracles, and Elisha exactly double, 16. So what he says to them is that you won't see any clouds, you won't see any rain, there'll be no wind, but the place where right near where you're going to do battle is going to fill with water, meaning not in a natural way. And he said that this would occur, and that is what occurred. Miraculously, the valleys where they were preparing to fight filled with water. Now they had water to drink. And what happened is the next day, on the eve of the battle, so Moab looks and sees that the valleys are full of water, and when the sun shone on them, it appeared to them that they were red. And so they interpreted this, that these 3 kings, they understood that these 3 kings were getting together to fight them, but they were not natural allies. And so they see the water and it appears to them to be red, and they say they must have fought against each other. And that's why the water is turned into blood. And so therefore, let us attack. So they attack, but it was really a trap. And they went into the trap, and Moab was completely defeated. And all of this, Elisha told him, this is exactly what's going to happen. And so excuse me, it's not Aram. I said the nation of Aram, it's Moab. I'm sorry, it's Moab that is fighting against them. Aram was a previous battle. The book of Kings is just one battle after another. So when the king saw that they were being defeated, he tries to break through, but he couldn't. And here is a very strange thing, the 27th verse of chapter 3. So it says that he took his firstborn son, this is the king of Moab, and he offered him for a burnt offering, in other words, human sacrifice. And the text says this is the one who would inherit the kingship from his father. His father was so either desperate or distraught or frustrated. And so he, in his attempt to get his gods to come on his side, he sacrifices his own son on the wall. And it didn't do anything. And so they departed. So here we see that idol worship, not just idol worship, but human sacrifice was still being practiced. And that's why in the book of Devarim, it warns many times not to serve the idol of Moloch, because they practiced a human sacrifice. And the Torah repeats it a number of times. So it is very significant that here in the text, they actually have an example of human sacrifice that was happening even at that time. Now we go to chapter 4, and we kind of change gears here. So Elisha is now, it doesn't say exactly where he is, but it says that one of the women of the wives of the prophets, of literally the sons of the prophets. This term, B'nai Nevi'im, comes up many, many, many times. And as we mentioned, at this point of history, there were schools of prophecy that the prophets banded together, and people who, it's not so much they wanted to be what we refer to as a prophet. They wanted to be closer to Hashem. And the prophets were teaching people different methodologies of coming close to Hashem through meditation, through prayer, through music. Music was a very, very, very important part of what the Nevi'im were teaching, what the prophets were teaching, as to how to reach higher levels of consciousness. So here it says that one of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha and said, "Your servant, my husband, has passed away, and you know that he was a God-fearing person, and he left me and my children in terrible debt, and now the creditor wants to take my sons and to basically enslave them in lieu of us paying our debt." Excuse me. So the question is, who is this woman and who is her husband? It doesn't name it. And so by tradition, this is the wife of Ovadia. Ovadia the prophet, who in previous chapters was a very, very important person. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'dbaro. Just to review, Ovadia, first of all, he was a convert, but he was on a very, very high level, and he became a prophet. He is one of the 12 minor prophets, and he lived in the time of Eliyahu Navi. So he was one of the students. That's why she says that he was among the B'nai Nevi'im, but he was a prophet in his own right. And he was like a double agent. I'll use the modern terminology, because he worked for Achav, the evil king, who was a terrible idol worshiper. And yet Achav didn't know that he was a prophet. And what happened when Achav and Izebel were killing all of the prophets, quite literally, he hid 100 prophets, 50 in one cave and 50 in another cave. And they fed them. Now, this is not an easy thing to feed 100 people on an ongoing basis. And so Ovadia and his wife, this is the woman who is now appealing to Elisha for help. They, out of their own pocket, were supporting 100 Nevi'im. And that's why she is so in debt. So she comes and she doesn't name him, but it's obvious to Elisha who they're talking about. So he says to her, what can I do for you? What do you have in your house? And she said, I have nothing. I have a small jar of oil. So he said to her, this is another miracle done by Elisha. Obviously, God is, in a certain way, God is doing the miracles through the prophet. So he says to her, tell your sons to go to all the neighbors and gather as many vessels as you can. As many vessels as you can. And they did that. And he said to her, start pouring from this little jar of oil. So she is pouring and fills up vessel after vessel after vessel. Oil was a very, very important commodity in those days. Oil had a lot of uses. They didn't have electricity then. And it was the main component of light. But it also had many other usages. It was used still in a Mediterranean diet. One of the most important things is olive oil on everything. And all kinds of perfumes were made from oil, all kinds of cleaning agents were made from oil. So he had many, many uses. So she's filling up vessel after vessel after vessel. And then she runs out of vessels. And so they one second. So she said to her sons, we're out of vessels, get me more vessels. But they had borrowed everything they could from the neighbors. And they came back and said, there are no more vessels that we can get. The oil stopped. And so Elisha said to her, now go sell the oil and pay back your debts. So we assume here that it was many, many vessels. And she was able to sell the oil and pay off her debts. So here we see this becomes like a parable or an allegory for the whole relationship of light and vessel. That as great as light is, if there's no vessel to contain it, then in a certain sense, the light doesn't shine. The light needs a vessel. An example is, let's say, Shabbat, the light of Shabbat. This is something that we've mentioned many times, but the numerical value of Shabbat is 702. And the numerical value of light is exactly the opposite in numbers, 207, 702 and 207. And so the idea is when Shabbat comes, it comes all over the world. It is Shabbat. The only question is, in a certain way, who plugs into it? Who becomes a vessel for that light? If you don't make yourself a vessel for the light of Shabbat, then you're not even aware that it's Shabbat. And so the way we make a vessel for Shabbat, interestingly, is for desisting from work. That creates the kind of vessel that Shabbat needs for its light to shine. So this idea, it appears throughout Kabbalah and Chassidut, the relationship of light and vessel. That even though we tend to think of the vessel as the minor part of the formula, but light needs a vessel. So here, as long as she had vessels, the oil would have continued. The oil is the element that makes light. And as soon as the vessels ran out, then the oil stopped. So this little story here is used as a parable, a metaphor, in symbolic terms of the relationship of light and vessel. Now we're in the fourth chapter, the 8th verse, and here we have a new story, a new event. So Elisha is passing through a place called Shunam, and it says there was a woman of great note there. Here she's called an Isha Gedola, a great woman. And here again, no name is given. Just like in the previous story, no name is given. So in the previous story, there's really no disagreement among the commentaries who we're talking about here. Here, there are many, many different commentaries. Who is this great woman? Yeah. So one of the explanations is that based on where she's from, Shunam, there is another person in the first book, actually in Shmuel, of someone from Shunam. She was called Shunamite, and that is Avishag. If you remember who Avishag is, when David is basically on his deathbed, and he's very weak, and this is right before he passes away, he couldn't get warm. Part of his malady is that he was cold all the time. So they gave this advice: find a young woman who will literally lay with you, not sexually. We're told specifically that he never had relations with her, and she will warm you. And the person that they found was Avishag Hashunamite. And she was, by all records, very, very beautiful. And so some want to say that because this very great woman here is from the same place, that it was her sister. Now, the problem with that is that we're a couple of generations later. From the story of David to where we are now is many generations. And so even though they're from the same place, some people say that she just lived a very long life. Others say this is one of the prophets that appeared in the first book of Kings. His name was Iddo. And some say it was the wife of Iddo. Others say it was the mother of Iddo. So again, like many, many, many examples, we have different opinions who this person was. Here it's less clear to get a definitive answer. Some say she was called a great woman because she was known for her hospitality. It appears that she was somewhat wealthy, and she used her wealth to host people, to help people. And so that's why she was called Gedolah. She was a great woman. So what happens is she said to her husband, she said, there is this holy man. She doesn't say this holy man named Elisha. She just says there's this holy man who passes by us all the time. We should help provide for him. He's known to be a holy person. We're into being hospitable. So let's build for him like an attic, an Airbnb, that anytime he passes by, that could be his place that he could find rest. So she said, let's build him this place, this upper chamber. And she says, we'll put in it a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. That's what she says. And when he comes, we'll be able to feed him. He'll be able to rest. And it'll be a big mitzvah. He's a very, very holy person. And so that's what they do. They build this place for him. And when he comes by, they tell him, please, we want to host you, and it'll be good for you. So some say, why do we have to know exactly what they put in the room? So some say that it's in the order. Since he's coming from a trip, he's going to be very tired. So he needs a bed. And after he's rested a little bit, obviously he's going to be hungry. He needs a table to be able to eat. Well, if he has a table, he has to have a chair to sit at the table. And so after he's rested and he's eaten, we have to also give him a lamp so he'll be able to learn in the evenings. So it's a very beautiful explanation of why they have to mention these four things. In other words, they were such good hosts that they were trying to think of everything that would make him comfortable. And so Elisha takes him up on this, and when he passes, he stays there. So one time, he called to her and said, you've been so hospitable. What can I do for you? And she basically says, nothing. I'm happy to do this. I don't need anything. I'm very happy. And Elisha was, oh, please let me do something for you. And so Elisha's call it his servant, the one that, just like he was a servant for Eliyahu. So his name is Gehazi. Gehazi was his, we'll call it servant. And so he said, you should know that they don't have any children, even though she didn't ask for it. So he said to Elisha, maybe she really does need something. And so Elisha, he called to her and said, at this time next year, you will have a son. And she said to him, please don't lie to me. Either she was too old. That is one of the opinions, that she was quite old at that time. Or perhaps she couldn't have children. That's why they didn't have children. Or her husband couldn't give her children. So she said, please, it's very nice of you, but don't lie to me, implying that for her to have a child would be somewhat miraculous. But sure enough, the next year she has a son. And the story continues. And at one point, it doesn't mention how old the child is at this point, but he's out in the field working with his father. And he says, Roshi, Roshi, my head, my head. And he dies on the spot. And no, excuse me. The father says to one of his helpers, take my son, who's obviously sick, back to his mother. She will take care of him. So it wasn't that it appeared that he was going to die. So he's taken back to the mother, and the mother is trying to take care of him, and he dies on her knees. And so she is obviously very distraught. And so she took him to the upper chamber and laid him on Elisha's bed. And then she goes to her husband and says, I need a donkey because I have to go to the man of God. Now, apparently, Elisha at this point was at the Carmel. Now, this is also significant because I haven't mentioned this, but Elisha keeps on going to the different places where Eliyahu used to be. Here, this is where Eliyahu performs this great miracle of bringing fire down from heaven. Really, again, God is doing the miracle through him, but that was on Har Carmel. So Elisha is in Har Carmel. It's implied that this place, Shunam, is somewhere near Carmel. And she asked her husband, please provide for me a donkey. I want to go see the man of God. That's what she refers him to. Isha Elohim, just like Eliyahu is called a man of God. Now Elisha is the one called a man of God. And so he says to her, why are you going? It's not Shabbat and it's not Rosh Chodesh. So from this we learn this idea that it's brought down in the Talmud that to this day, especially on a holiday, it's considered a great mitzvah if one can be in the presence of one's Rebbe. So that's why even hundreds of years ago, at the time of the great courts of the Rebbes of the Hasidic movement in Europe, so you read all of these stories that every Shabbat, and especially the Chagim, hundreds and in many cases thousands of people would come to be with their Rebbe on Shabbat and holidays. Today, it still exists, but here it's, let's say, the Belzer Rebbe in Yerushalayim. Okay, so all the Belzer Hasidim in Yerushalayim, it's not hard to everyone go to the main shul to be close to the Rebbe. Probably the classic case today is on Rosh Hashanah, when tens of thousands of people travel to the Ukraine to be at the burial place of Rabbi Nachman. Because before he passed away, he told his students that they should gather together on 3 holidays, on Hanukkah, on Shavuos, and especially Rosh Hashanah. And so today, literally, I think last year there were between 30 and 40,000 people in the Ukraine, in Uman, where Rabbi Nachman is buried. So he says to his wife, it's not Rosh Chodesh or Shabbat. Why are you going to the man of God? And she just says, I need to go to him. So she goes and she finds Elisha. And she says to him, didn't I say to you, don't lie to me? In other words, why did you give me a son who is only going to die in his youth? And she doesn't actually say the whole thing. She just says, did I desire a son of that you should give me a miracle? Didn't I say, don't deceive me? Elisha understood from this that something happened to him, and he assumed that he had died. So he said to Gehazi, take my rod and go with her and put the rod on his head, and hopefully it will revive him. And so that is what happens. Now, Elisha was going to follow, but for whatever reason, he figured that Gehazi could get there before him. It didn't work. So Elisha followed, and it says in the text, the child was laying dead on his bed. And he came, he closed the door, and he began to pray to God. It doesn't say what he prayed, but obviously he's praying with his whole heart and soul. And then it says that he got up and he laid on the boy. He put his mouth on his mouth, like recitation. He put his eyes on his eyes and his palms on his palms. So this is a very vivid picture. He's laying on him, palm on palm, eye on eye, mouth on mouth. And the flesh of the boy began to warm up. And then Elisha got up and he began to walk back and forth in the room. We're assuming that he is praying here. And then, again, he stretched himself out on the child, and the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. And Elisha said to Gehazi, call the Shunamite. Here she's called the Shunamite. This is the first time. Before it was just, she was a great woman from Shunam. Here she's called the Shunamite. And she comes up and he says to her, take your son. And it says that she fell on her at his feet and took her son and went out. And that's the end of the story. So here, again, we see Eliyahu performs what we call Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. And Elisha also is the resurrection of the dead. And now, Elisha comes again to Gilgal. Again, this is another place where Eliyahu was. He was at Carmel, Gilgal, by the Jordan, all of these places, Beit El. So Elisha keeps on going. Now, one of the reasons is because groups of prophets were in all of these places. And so Elisha is like doing the rounds, just like Eliyahu did the rounds and taught them. Elisha is now the premier prophet of the time. And all of the B'nai Nevi'im, in a certain way, are now his students. So he comes to Gilgal, and again, it says that the B'nai Nevi'im were sitting before him, and and he said that they make some pottage for all of the students. They have to eat. And so they're making this pottage, and one of them goes out to the field. Now we have to know, in those days, they had a very, very good knowledge of plants, what could be eaten, what could be used for different healing, for ailments. But one of them came back with all these herbs and put them in the pottage, but apparently, and there were some wild gourds, but apparently he obviously felt that they were edible, but they put them in the pottage and they served all of the students. And at one point, the men, they cried out and they said, "There's death in the pot." Like they feel like they're about to die. And so Elisha said, "Take some meal and put it in the pot and pour out the pottage, and no harm will come to them." So again, this is another miracle by Elisha, one after the other. And then he goes to a place called Baal Shalisha. No, excuse me. They're still in Gilgal. And a man from Baal Shalisha comes, and he wants to help out. So he comes with 20 loaves of barley and ears of grain in a sack. And so Elisha says, "Feed the B'nai Nevi'im." Again, we assume that there were a lot of them. And Gehazi says to him, "How are we going to feed all these people with 20 loaves of bread? We would need, like, he doesn't say it, but like, we need way more than that." Oh, it mentions that there were 100 men. So we assume these were small loaves of bread, because you can imagine if they're big loaves of bread, okay, 5 person for a loaf. But the assumption is that they were very small loaves of bread. And he says, how are we going to feed all these people with 20 loaves? And so he said, not only will they eat, but there will be left over. So they put the loaves of bread before them, and they ate, and there was some left over, just as God had said. Because when he said they'll eat and they'll be left over, first he says, and God says, obviously he received a prophecy. God was saying, this is what you should tell them. God is saying, you will eat and they'll be left over. And that ends chapter 4. So I just want to make a comment here. I'm just going to make it in a general way, because we touched on this before, that when you read the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha, and you read specifically the prophecies of Isaiah, what we see, and again, I'm not making a moral judgment here. It's not positive or negative. I'm just making a statement that is worth considering, that when we look at some of the stories in the New Testament, we see that there are many, many precedents for what is written in the New Testament in these stories. And I'm thinking of it just because this is one of them. It's not the only one. Last week, it was Amy who pointed out from Rav Steinsaltz that there was the description of John the Baptist was very, very similar to the description of Eliyahu Navi. But here, this whole idea of feeding the masses with hardly anything, when Eliyahu walks on water, Elisha walks on water, the whole idea of the resurrection of the dead, these are the pouring of the oil, that as long as there were vessels, the oil would continue to flow. Many of the stories in the New Testament mirror or are reminiscent of these stories. Everyone can come to their own conclusion as to what that means. I don't want to go to that place, but I think it's worth mentioning because it is very, very important. However, people want to, how they want to take it. So again, I want to say that our learning tonight is dedicated for a refuah shlema for Rachel Fruma bat Rivka. She should have a refuah shlema.